So good afternoon. Usually after lunch, there is a little bit of a decline in energy levels, and I will attempt to address that with my distinguished colleagues on the podium, Mr. Mulay and Mr. Salman Zafar. Looking at the general theme of bioenergy and biotechnology, let me go to the first slide, and I'll point out that all of this links to the Sustainable Development Goals, but number 7, which is energy, and number 13, which is climate action, is central to the theme of the conference this year. Going to the next slide. Since we're using the word sustainability very frequently, let's get some principles out there. These are articulated very far back as 1993 by one of Egypt's foremost thinkers, Ismail Serageldin. And essentially what it says is that you must not harvest anything, whether it's non-renewables or renewables, faster than the earth can regenerate it. And if you're taking out non-renewables, then you must develop long-term substitutes at a rate faster than your depletion rate. Similarly, if you create waste, the waste must not burden the environment in any way. So you reduce these two rules, you reduce them to a simple atomic measure. What it means is that human beings are the only species that create molecular load on the environment that no other species does. That's why we use the words like pristine forest, pristine beach. It doesn't mean clean, but it means untouched by human hands or other human activity. Now, how are we going to weave that into our energy matrix? And how are we going to talk about petroleum, coal, natural gas, bioenergy, etc., in one single breath when we look at sustainability as the lens of vision? Next slide, please. So this is our 250 years of progress map. It tells you very quickly that all the things we measure success by, which is GDP, and by foreign investment, and for example, by the number of motor vehicles that people own and are on the roads, all of those have increased, but everything else has also increased. So we are not really, as human beings, able to maintain balance in our consumption patterns and their consequences. So on the next slide, let's get some definitions, or rather some principles down here. The first one is that if we are going to be sustainable, that means if we are going to extract resources at a reasonable rate for the earth, then we must reduce the rate at which we burden the earth, which means population growth rates must fall, the substitution of human capital for natural resources must take place, and we have to reduce poverty so that there is equity, and future generations at all levels of society are equally equipped to grow. This is another great thinker, Panayotu, and below that we see some comments from Irwin, but at the bottom, the last one more, this is Sarzatakis, Greek philosopher writer, really says that the root cause of all environmental problems is overconsumption and population increase. Why is that? Let me take everybody back to class 7 physics. We all learned in class 7 that machines take in energy and put out work. No machine gives you 100% of the work relative to the energy you put in. Therefore, every machine is wasting energy, and every machine is contributing to climate change. So the moment I make a machine work unnecessarily, whether it's for that extra item of clothing or whether it's for extra travel that I didn't need to do, I'm burdening the earth. Until that thinking goes to all people, so where we were is about overconsumption, and Professor Sarzatakis' comment that do you really need 12 sweaters, 23 dresses, 9 pairs of jeans, and 6 pairs of boots is a reflection of the overconsumption philosophy that all our newspapers, all our targeted advertising on our mobiles is telling us to go out and buy. Consumption-driven society cannot give you a balanced world under any circumstance unless we consciously offset that balance by restoring resources to the earth. And that's why we hear this phrase frequently, 3 Rs, reduce, reuse, recycle. That addresses the reduce portion. Let's go to the next slide. This is the most telling piece of information that if I look over the last 115 years and look at how natural resources have moved, compared to population, everything else has grown by a factor of more than 1, except food availability. The only parameter that has declined in the last 115 years compared to population is per capita food. Everything else has gone up. This tells you that there is some critical imbalance between basic needs and between perceived needs and unnecessary consumption. Obviously, we are not going to tell people you don't buy because global economic models are designed on that. What we have to say is, when you buy, think about what resources went into the product or service that you bought. Can we bring down the carbon footprint of the products and services that we are buying? Now, carbon footprint is easy to say, very hard to measure. Let's go to the next slide. Essentially, let's just stick to manufactured goods for now. Services are even more complex. That what you can see is in the 5 components of the life cycle, which starts with the raw materials, goes through manufacture, the freight of the raw materials and the finished goods, their use and their disposal. In all of these, the approximate CO2 that you are putting out is roughly the same. It varies product by product, commodity by commodity, but all 5 areas have to be addressed if you want to decarbonize the earth. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a slide I like to put up in almost every talk, but I will put it up with a very interesting caveat this year. If we look at how many atoms of carbon we buy as a country, we import them as crude oil or coal or petcoke or natural gas, it's roughly 330 million tons in 2022. Yeah, I've written 230 below, which is wrong. It should be 330. But in any case, what is heartening is that 4 years ago, or rather 5 years ago, 2018 data, this number was 350 million tons. In 5 years, India has actually reduced 6% of its carbon demand. And this has only happened because of 3 major shifts. The first is the ethanol blending program. The second is the tremendous thrust towards renewable grids and decarbonization of our grid through solar. And the third, believe it or not, is because we are using our coal more smartly. We were actually earlier using imported coal for everything. We have now learned to categorize and grade our domestic coal and use a lot more domestic coal compared to imported. And that same 330 million tons, if I see what I'm throwing away in the country, we are throwing away more than 460 million tons of carbon atoms. So theoretically, India is self-sufficient in our energy needs. It is only because we're habituated to these imports that we're doing it, but we could as a country stand up and say, we don't need your carbon, international community. We could theoretically say that. Also because we have a lot of underutilized land, and Mr. Ramakrishna has been an advocate of this from 2004 onwards, I would say at the very earliest, almost 2 decades now. If we were to deploy our 40 million hectares of underutilized but irrigated land, we could actually meet most of these targets. The question is, do we have the technology and do we have the water, the energy and everything else we need to make it happen? Next slide, please. So let's look at these in 2 ways. One is the supply side solution. Where can I get carbon atoms within India? And what do I do with them? So next slide. Yesterday at the Aero Show, we signed an agreement with the Indian Air Force and the Mangalore refinery to build a plant to build 20,000 liters of sustainable aviation fuel per day. This plant will be operational in 2025. I said 15,000, but now it's 20,000 in the agreement. And the key to this is feedstock supplies. As you will hear from my other colleagues in this session, feedstock becomes constrained because of our lack of planning, not because it's really constrained. Also because we are sending our precious reusable carbon atoms to foreign countries where somebody else is making biofuel with our own carbon. So that's not logical, and a market mechanism is required to balance this through policy because it will very quickly improve our self-reliance if we can do that. But this is a good story. We've been pursuing it now for almost 5 years since the first flight, and almost 15 years since the concept was first mooted in 2009 in IIP in Dehradun. And we are able to show that a centralized collection of waste oils can lead to a centralized production of jet fuel. Next slide. Similarly, biomethane, which is, if you go back to the earlier, we don't have to go back, but in the earlier slide I had shown that this was the biggest resource out of the roughly 460 million tons of carbon atoms, 180 million tons is biogas potential. So again, if I don't export my raw materials, don't export my agricultural waste, etc., I can tap into a very large pool of biogas potential. And we have a biomethane plant currently operating in Rudrapur after running it for 4 years in Pune. This is a technology that uses very little energy to separate the methane and CO2 and give you pipeline quality natural gas. There's also good logic here to not have so much CBG, but to have more BioPNG, direct injection in the pipeline, so that you eliminate the compression cost, which would otherwise be required to compress and transport cylinders of CBG. Go on to the next slide. This is another big source of waste in India, which is waste plastics. At IIP, we currently run a 1 ton a day plant capable of producing either either diesel or gasoline or even petrochemicals. This plant has been running now, next slide please, for the last almost 4 years, and we're more or less ready now for technology demonstration to partners. And we operate it ourselves. We are the only research institute in the country to consistently operate a plant of this size. But it doesn't lower your carbon footprint. This I should be very clear, it's waste plastic. So it's not bio. And because it's not bio, I cannot claim that it reduces my carbon footprint. What it does do, it reduces plastic pollution. What we do is we have a partner, Sustainable Development for Communities Foundation, and they have helped us set up 20 plastic banks across Dehradun, where community people just put their waste plastic instead of putting it in the bin. So it's a little bit of behavior change. Schools, colleges, hospitals, they put the plastic in a dedicated place, and we are then able to collect it through a dedicated mechanism. And we've signed an MOU with the government of Delhi, actually with the DDA and with the municipal corporations. And we are hoping to build a plant of 10x this size to eliminate accumulation of further plastic waste at the landfills in Bhalaswa, Okhla, and Gazipur. Anybody who's going out of India by a highway, out of Delhi by a highway, must be seeing Bhalaswa or Gazipur all the time. Next slide. This is our latest. It's called a mobile pyroformer. What it does is it takes agricultural waste in the field. So it's mounted on a truck. The truck drives into the field, and it takes about 2.5 tons a day of rice straw, 100 kgs an hour roughly, and it converts that rice straw first to pellets and then into a char, a bio oil, and gas. The gas is actually used to power the operations, and the char goes to fertilizer, and the bio oil is used for brick kilns and other local applications. So this is decentralized. Instead of bringing the biomass to a central point, we take the machine to the farmer's field. And it completes one field, it goes on to the next field. And at a sort of a double the scale that we are at currently, about 5 tons a day, the machine pays back in barely 2 seasons. We go to the next slide. Now we look at demand side reduction. How can I actually reduce the carbon that I require? So the 350, 330 million tons that I need, how can I bring that number down? The first one, and that's for anybody who's living in Delhi and has pipe gas, please change your burner. Changing it to an energy efficient burner will save 25% of that waste right away. So if you have an old LPG stove and you said, okay, you know, when I'm taking PNG, I'll take the same stove and I'll just change my nozzle. That does not give you the same energy saving or the same safety, mind you, because LPG is heavier than air and PNG is lighter than air. The same burner cannot do both duties, and your kitchen will always be at risk of a fire if you haven't made the switch. These new burners are about 4,000 rupees per 4-burner top, about 2,500 rupees per 2-burner top, and there are 40 companies selling this in India now. The saving to the country, if everybody with existing connections switches over is 2,200 crores per year. That's the saving in money. And the carbon footprint saving, you can imagine that PNG is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of greenhouse gas potential. Remember, all our LPG is, all our natural gas, or the bulk of it is imported. So by doing this, you're also saving foreign exchange. Save foreign exchange, save your electricity bill, save your gas bill, and save the carbon emissions. Next slide. Another thing we can do as we are going into EVs is look at EV charging stations. The big pain point today for charging stations is batteries, because lithium-ion batteries are expensive and India imports lithium, so I create a new problem while solving an old problem. Instead, using bioenergy and putting a biofuel or a biogas genset to couple with a wind-solar hybrid using a smart controller, we are now operating 15 kilowatt power on our own campus, and that 15 kilowatts has no battery storage. None at all. Whenever the sun is shining, it takes solar. Whenever the wind is blowing, it takes wind. And when neither is there, it just draws from a biogas plant. Even if I think of this as a partially renewable, that means if I even hooked it up to a natural gas pipeline, which has biogas injected in it, I still save a good bit of my carbon footprint, as well as of my imported carbon atoms. Similarly, other issues like improved vehicle design, solar water heaters, these are all known. But the more you measure, the more you realize that all of this can be done. Go to the next slide. This is another one. Now you're reading stuff about vehicle scrapping policy, about fines, if you're found with an old car and all that. But the carbon footprint of scrapping a car is very high. You have to first abandon the car. You have to take it to a disposal point on a truck. After taking it to a disposal point, it has to be manually stripped out. After stripping it out manually or mechanically, you have to melt it. So imagine how much heat is required to melt the car in a furnace. After melting, you will reuse it. So how much energy is used to reconvert that into auto parts? Instead, we just take out the engine. We take out the clutch. We put in an induction motor. We put in a battery, a charger. We rebalance the car using that, using a pre-conversion analysis. We rebalance the car for a weight to performance ratio that is as good or better than the old car. And the post-conversion car I've been driving for the last 4 years without any problems, peak speed of 60 kilometers an hour, and it goes over 100 kilometers per charge. We've just signed an agreement with the government of Manipur, Department of Transportation. Manipur is one of India's worst carbon footprint states for energy because it gets all its fuel from Assam, 1,000 kilometers away, by a single highway with extremely low speed, so the trucks are idling there all the time and wasting the energy required to carry fuel. So we are proposing to train several thousand people in Manipur to retrofit vehicles, and old vehicles can then be retrofitted, become EVs, and use renewable charging stations because Manipur is blessed with both solar and wind. So I see, for example, we have Mr. Basu here from ECMA. You would realize that retrofitting a car is actually the lowest hanging fruit available to the country, especially for people who do not want to be forced to dispose their old car and buy a new car. Not everybody will have that capital available to them. This conversion takes place at a cost of between 1 to 1.5 lakhs, depending on the vehicle make, plus the cost of the battery. But if the battery is swapped, so if it is on a lease or use model, then that 1.5 lakh cost gives you a permanently living car because electric vehicles have no scrapping date. The Gazette notification for this is already out since 2017. So from the point of view of regulatory requirement, the only thing that is now needed is a type approval. We are hoping to present the type approval to the country within about 3 months from now, with indigenous kits to do the conversion. Next slide. So to sum up, we've been talking about sustainability. It is no longer fashionable. It's just essential for all of us to do. The key components are decarbonization. That means reduce the carbon footprint, but also resource efficiency. Try to recycle all the resources rather than mining them afresh from the ground. Some examples that I showed you: used cooking oils, agri-waste, end-of-life assets, and so on. Ideally, they should be recycled locally so that I'm not spending more carbon footprint transporting them. And what we really need is much more R&D to unlock this value and put this R&D into the hands of our startups, into the hands of our corporates, into the hands of our state governments, so that you get long-term value for the nation and a long-term contribution to the net zero goals. The last slide is of my campus. For those of you who've been there, I would say it's one of the cleanest and most eco-conscious places in the country. We don't have mobile towers, and we've seen our honey yield shoot up. We've seen our number of butterflies go from 30s to 90 plus. We are actually, the next bird count is tomorrow, so hopefully we will do better than where we are now. And we invite all of you to visit. Thank you for your attention.